The snow came down like judgment that night in December of 1881, and when the eastbound train pulled into the depot at Larkspur Junction, Colorado, the woman stepped off into a scene that would haunt her for the rest of her days. A man collapsed against the station wall, a small girl wrapped inside his coat, both of them so still that for one terrible moment she believed she was looking at the dead. If you believe in kindness, in faith, in redemption, and in the kind of second chances that only God and good people can offer, then before you read another word, take a moment to like this story, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs a little hope tonight, and subscribe for more tales from the American frontier. Her name was Charlotte Ann Reeves, and she had not planned to stop in Larkspur Junction at all. She was bound for Denver, wrapped in a mink-lined traveling coat that had cost more than most ranch hands earned in a year, riding in the private car her late husband's railroad fortune had purchased for her. Franklin Reeves had been dead 18 months, taken by pneumonia after a winter chill much like this one, and Charlotte had spent those 18 months learning the particular loneliness that comes from having every material comfort a person could want, and no one left to share it with. She was 34 years old, childless, and so wealthy that men in 3 territories knew her name before they ever laid eyes on her face, and every one of them, it seemed, wanted a piece of what Franklin had left behind rather than any piece of her. The train had stopped only because a rock slide further up the pass had blocked the line, and the conductor announced it would be delayed until morning. Charlotte, restless in her private car, wrapped herself in furs and stepped out onto the platform to breathe air that did not smell of coal smoke and velvet upholstery. That was when she saw him, a broad-shouldered man in a threadbare canvas coat, his hat crusted with ice, sitting propped against the depot wall with a child of perhaps 5 years pressed against his chest, his arms locked around her even in what looked like unconsciousness. The girl's lips had gone the pale blue-gray of a winter sky, and the man's breathing came in shallow rattles that Charlotte could hear even over the wind. She did not call for help. She did not send a porter. Charlotte Reeves, who had spent a year and a half letting servants do everything from lace her boots to pour her coffee, threw herself down into the snow beside 2 strangers and began pulling her own fur coat from her shoulders to wrap around the child. She screamed for the station master, and when the sleepy old man came running, she ordered him with a voice that brooked no argument to fetch every blanket in that station house and to stoke the stove until the walls sweated. It took 4 men to carry the pair inside, and it took Charlotte nearly an hour of rubbing the child's small hands between her own, of pressing her own body heat against the little girl's, before those blue lips turned to a fragile pink again. The man's name, they would learn once the fever broke enough for him to speak, was Josiah Hale Carter, a widower of 29 who had been traveling on foot and by whatever wagon would carry him from a played-out claim near Leadville, trying to reach his sister's homestead outside Larkspur Junction before the mountain roads closed for winter. His wife, Rebecca, had died birthing their daughter, whom he had named Faith, and in the 5 years since, Josiah had worked himself half to death trying to be father, mother, provider, and protector all at once, first in the mining camps and then, when the silver played out and left him with nothing but debts and a broken pickaxe, on the long walk east. They had run out of food 2 days before reaching the junction. They had run out of firewood the night before that. When the station agent found no train scheduled to stop, Josiah had simply sat down in the only shelter he could find and held his daughter as tight as his failing strength allowed, praying, he would tell Charlotte later, his voice breaking on the words, that if the Lord meant to take him that night, he would at least let Faith live to see morning. Charlotte sat beside that hospital cot in the small room above the general store where the town's aging physician tended them both, and she did not leave for 3 days. She sent a wire to Denver canceling her business there. She sent another to her household staff instructing them to prepare rooms, plural, at her townhouse. She told herself, in those first days, that she was simply doing what any Christian woman would do for a suffering child, but there was something in the way Josiah Carter looked at her when the fever finally broke, something raw and grateful and entirely without calculation, that struck a place in her heart no fortune-hunting suitor in Denver had ever come close to touching. He did not know who she was. He did not know about the railroad shares or the cattle interests, or the mansion with its imported chandeliers. He only knew that a stranger had knelt in the snow to save his daughter's life, and when he tried to thank her, his voice cracked with a shame that broke Charlotte's heart even further, the shame of a man who had nothing to offer in return. She would not hear of it. She insisted, over his fierce protests, that father and daughter recover under her care rather than in the drafty back room the town offered as charity lodging. Josiah fought her on it the way a proud man fights anything that feels like pity, arguing that he had never in his life taken a handout he hadn't earned, that his own father had raised him to believe a man who couldn't provide for his family had failed at the only job that mattered. Charlotte, who had learned something about grief and pride from watching her own husband work himself into an early grave rather than admit he needed rest, sat across from him at the little kitchen table in the boarding house and told him plainly that there was no shame in accepting help, only in refusing to offer it when you had the means. She reminded him that his daughter had very nearly died on that platform, and that pride was a poor blanket against a Colorado winter. Something in her steadiness, in the way she did not flinch from his anger nor coddle his wounded dignity, reached him in a way charity never could have. By the time the roads cleared enough for travel, Josiah had agreed, for Faith's sake if nothing else, to let Charlotte's driver take them as far as her townhouse in Denver, if only to see the child properly fed and warmed before they continued on to his sister's homestead. What was meant to be a single night's rest became a week, and the week became a month, and in that month Charlotte Reeves watched a man rebuild himself before her eyes. She found him honest work first, not charity, for she understood by now that charity would wound him, but real labor overseeing repairs on one of the properties her late husband had left neglected, a position that tested his skill with wood and stone and paid him a fair wage he could look at without flinching. Josiah threw himself into that work with the same desperate devotion he'd once given to a played-out silver claim, and in the evenings he would return to find Faith curled up on the parlor rug listening to Charlotte read from a worn Bible that had been Franklin's, the two of them laughing over some small joke that had nothing to do with fortunes or funerals or frozen train platforms. Faith, who had spent her short life being carried from camp to camp with barely a roof over her head, began for the first time to sleep through the night without waking in terror, began to ask, in the innocent way of children, whether Charlotte might be something like a mother, since her own had gone to be with the angels before Faith ever got to know her face. It was that question, asked by a 5-year-old over a bowl of stew on an ordinary Tuesday evening, that undid every careful wall Charlotte had built around her own grief. She excused herself from the table and wept in the hallway, not from sorrow but from something she had not felt in so long she barely recognized it, the terrifying, wonderful sensation of a heart daring to hope again. Josiah found her there, and for the first time since the station platform, he reached out and took her hand, not as a man grateful to his benefactor, but as a man who had watched a woman kneel in the snow for his daughter and had spent every day since falling further in love with her steady, unshowy courage. He told her, haltingly, that he had nothing to offer a woman of her station, no fortune, no name that opened doors, nothing but a strong back and a heart that would work itself to the bone for her, and for Faith both. Charlotte, through her tears, told him that she had buried a husband whose fortune had never once made her feel as safe, as seen, as cherished as she had felt watching Josiah Carter hold his dying daughter tight enough to share his own warmth with her. Money, she said, had never once knelt beside her in the snow. He had. Word of the courtship spread through Denver society the way scandal always does, faster than any train, and it was not kind. Charlotte's late husband's business partners, men who had circled her like wolves since the funeral hoping to fold her fortune into their own through marriage or manipulation, took it as a personal insult that she would choose a penniless miner's widower over their calculated proposals. Chief among them was a banker named Edgar Whitcomb Sloane, a man who had loaned Franklin Reeves money in his early years and had spent the decades since positioning himself as the natural heir to whatever the widow might eventually offer, whether by marriage or by manipulation of her late husband's holdings, which Sloane partly controlled through a web of shares and debts Franklin had never fully settled. Sloane began, quietly at first and then with open cruelty, to spread word through the territory that Josiah Carter was nothing but a fortune hunter, a drifter who had staged his own collapse on that platform to prey upon a grieving widow's soft heart. He produced, or claimed to produce, records suggesting Josiah had abandoned debts in the mining camps, painting him not as a desperate father but as a con man who had learned to work sympathy the way other men worked acclaim. The accusation cut Josiah deeper than any physical wound the winter had given him, because it touched the one thing he had left after losing his wife and his claim, and nearly his daughter, his honor. He wanted to leave, to take faith and disappear back into the mountains rather than let Charlotte's name be dragged through scandal on his account, and it took every ounce of Charlotte's considerable will to stop him at the door with her hand pressed flat against his chest, telling him that she had not knelt in the snow for a stranger only to abandon the man he had become. She rode, that very week, into the mining district herself, hiring a private investigator with her own money to trace the truth of Sloane's accusations, and what she uncovered turned the scandal entirely on its head. The debts Josiah supposedly owed had in fact been forged in his name by a claim jumper who had stolen his identity papers during a campfire 2 years prior, a man who, upon investigation, was found to have several outstanding warrants of his own, and further digging revealed that Edgar Sloane had known this, or could easily have known it, and had spread the falsehood anyway out of pure self-interest, hoping to discredit Josiah before he could stand in the way of Sloane's long campaign to control Franklin Reeves's remaining assets through the widow herself. The truth came out publicly at a town gathering meant to be nothing more than a winter social, when Charlotte stood before half of Denver's business elite and read aloud the investigators' findings in a voice that did not waver, naming Sloane's deception for exactly what it was. It was Sheriff Amos Baldwin, the territory's aging but respected lawman who had known Franklin Reeves for 20 years, who stepped forward that same night to confirm that formal charges of fraud and slander were being filed against Sloane, whose banking practices, once examined, revealed considerably more sin than a single false accusation. Sloane left Denver within the month in disgrace, and Josiah Carter, who had arrived in that town as a man with nothing but a half-frozen daughter and a broken pickaxe, walked out of that gathering with his name cleared and his head, for the first time in years, held high. They were married the following spring, in a small white chapel on the edge of town with wildflowers pushing up through the last patches of snow along the roadside, and Faith, now 6, walked ahead of Charlotte down the aisle scattering petals with the fierce solemnity only a child can bring to a sacred task. Charlotte wore no jewels that day, no imported lace, only a simple dress the color of new wheat, because she had learned in that Colorado winter that the things worth having could not be bought, only received with an open and grateful heart. Josiah, standing at the altar in a suit that fit him now, though it had been borrowed only months before, wept openly as she came toward him, and the whole small congregation of ranch hands and shopkeepers and the old station master who had first raised the alarm that December night wept along with him. They built their life together not in the marble mansion Charlotte had once occupied alone, but on a working ranch outside Larkspur Junction that Charlotte purchased and Josiah ran with his own 2 hands, because both of them had come to understand that a house full of love and honest labor was worth more than any fortune sitting empty in a bank vault. In the years that followed, their ranch became known throughout the territory not merely for its cattle or its fine horses, but for a standing rule that no traveler in genuine need would ever be turned away from its gate, a rule Josiah insisted upon the day they moved in memory of the stranger who had once knelt in the snow for a man she had never met. Faith grew up strong and unafraid, telling anyone who would listen the story of the mother who had saved her life before she even had the right to call her mother at all, and in time 2 more children joined the Carter household, filling rooms that had once echoed with Charlotte's loneliness with the sound of boots thundering down hallways and laughter carrying clear across the prairie at supper time. Old-timers in that part of Colorado would tell the story for decades afterward, at church socials and around ranch house fires, of the rich widow and the freezing father she found at the station, and how a single act of kneeling in the snow had rewritten the whole course of 2 broken lives into one unbroken family. If this story touched something in you tonight, I would love to hear from you. Tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from, and share what lesson this story left in your heart, whether it was about kindness, about second chances, or about the courage it takes to love again after loss. And if the tale of Charlotte and Josiah moved you the way it moved every soul who ever heard it told around a Colorado fireplace, take a moment before you go to like this story, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs to believe in second chances today, and subscribe so you never miss the next tale of faith, courage, and love from the American frontier.